Evening, everyone. So, yes, I thought we would discuss the COVID inquiry, and inevitably, I like when you ask a question, what really should happen after the COVID inquiry? John straight in. What should change after the COVID inquiry? The status of the participants' liberty. That seems to be where all the focus is. Obviously, the COVID inquiry is not going to press charges or anything like that. It's not looking for evidence of criminal activity. Naturally, the evidence that is being gathered and published, there's absolutely loads of evidence already published on the COVID inquiry website. I'm going to go over a Boris Johnson sort of statement as well as part of this. But it's if the National Crime Agency, which is the organisation that you would think, investigate if there was going to be an investigation. Yes, they may use some of this evidence. They'll have to collect more of their own evidence because they'll have a specific thing. But what I sort of meant was in terms of how we sort of protect ourselves, because it occurs to me that there is all this focus on will people see, criminal charges. But there's another issue as well in that. Let's just recap how this is going, right? This is the schedule as at the moment. So just to go through, they work on different modules, and the reason they work on different modules is so that different teams can collect evidence, work out how they're going to do it, collect evidence on various bits, because it's going to take a very long time. For example, if you look at there's active module, future module, right? So, and there could still be other modules. I don't know that 6 is definitely the limit. Unfortunately, they don't seem to be keeping their FAQ page up to date. On the FAQ page, which I did check again today, it still talks about just 3 modules. It's like, well, there's already 6 been published. But if you look down here, so resilience and preparedness, we've already had a certain amount of evidence being given on that one. In fact, I saw on Twitter recently, about a week or two ago, and everyone's suddenly sharing this thing that Matt Hancock wants immunity from prosecution. And I was thinking, yeah, that was like half a year ago. He didn't get it. He's already given evidence. There'll be times when he has to give evidence again because he was the health secretary, so he'll be given evidence probably in every module. But yeah, he didn't get it. So, but the fact that he asked for it does suggest that he thinks he might be legally liable. The core UK decision making and political governance, that's what we're into now. So in terms of the, think about this. This started in like March, I think. Will Simon Case be made to appear? Yes, he will. He's ill at the moment, and look, I'm a cynical old so and so, but he may actually be ill. It won't get him out of anything. He will be given evidence. This is going to last a long time, right? Think about this. We were hearing evidence for the resilience and preparedness like over half a year ago, I think, actually. I haven't checked exactly. We're on to the core UK decision-making and political governance, and this is going to go on for a while. Boris Johnson isn't even given his evidence until December. So I don't know how long that's going to go on for. Then we've got impact of COVID-19 pandemic on healthcare systems in the 4 nations of the UK, vaccines and therapeutics, procurement. Now, just to give you an idea of the timescale here, procurement, that 5th module, when will we be listening to the public evidence being given on that? Early 2025 is the plan. That's the plan. That's if everything else goes to schedule. If it doesn't, it could be later. Okay? In theory, I suppose it could be earlier. I suspect not. I suspect there's an awful lot of evidence to go through. And I also suspect that the government are going to try and be difficult at each stage, right? So, but the plan is early 2025. Then there's another module, care sector. That includes so people have asked me, so what about Dido Harding's, £37 billion budget for test and trace that Parliament said basically did nothing? That will presumably be in there, I imagine. So yeah, there's lots to come. And, if you think about it, we might not finish listening to evidence until late 2025. It's going to be a beast of a report to write, and then the recommendations. So we may not get all of that until like, might be 3 years' time before we get anything published, as in recommendations. And in the meantime, it occurs to me we have a bit of an issue here. In actual fact, we are less prepared for a pandemic now than we were in 2020. The government have actually made us less prepared. We know, for example, that as part of the Operation Cygnus, so for those who don't know, the government at one time the Tories used to take the pandemic seriously before it came. They knew it was coming. They took it, David Cameron sort of took it semi-seriously, right? Ordered Operation Cygnus. That reported back. Technically, that was Theresa May's gig. And they implemented very little of the recommendations. Because that's the worry here. You know, are they going to implement all the recommendations? You would think, well, yeah, we'll have a better government by then. But, you know, will they? And the other thing is, like, so Operation Cygnus said, well, you need a pandemic response team, right? You need a dedicated unit to coordinate everything when it hits. And so that was set up. It wasn't really being properly funded, but it existed. Then Boris Johnson got rid of it in 2019. Brilliant timing. He became Prime Minister halfway through 2019. Went, what are we doing this for? It's for a what? A pandemic? We're not likely to get one of those, are we? Yes, Prime Minister, it's the #1 threat to the nation. It probably won't happen. Let's get rid of it. So then we get rid of it. But we still don't have one. Wouldn't you have thought, like, if a government has a pandemic response unit, even if it's not properly funded, but they have one, and then a pandemic hits, and that pandemic goes really badly wrong because you get all your decisions wrong, wouldn't you think you'd go, we should actually get this pandemic response unit back so we're better prepared for the next one? But we haven't. So we're now worse prepared. Hancock wants to be a copper's narc. Well, I mean, it's not like in America. In America, you're instantly thinking, if there were to be serious criminal charges coming here, that lots of people who were implicated would give evidence in return for like a reduced sentence, like a suspended sentence, really. So they basically maybe get convicted but get away with it otherwise. I don't think that would happen here because, first of all, Matt Hancock is not one of the small fry. You know, it's like politically he was, because although he was the health secretary, he was never really one of Boris Johnson's clique. And it was always thought right back in 2020 when it was all going wrong, when COVID was sweeping through the care homes, it was said at the time, I mean, I covered it on my videos at the time, that Matt Hancock, because he's not really one of the Boris Johnson crowd, it was like, because people were saying, why doesn't he sack Matt Hancock? He's been bloody useless. And it was like, because he wants him to be the fall guy. He'll keep him around until it's time to get rid of him and put all the blame on him. In the event, that didn't have to happen. He sort of was sacked, but that was for something else. That was when Murdoch decided it was time for him to go. Will Dildo Harding, that's not very nice. Will Dido Harding be giving evidence? She'll be called to give evidence. But as I say, it'll be a long time. She'll be in that final module. I'm trying to think. She won't be in like step 2 because she's got nothing to do with the core decision making. So she'll just be in that final one. So she'll be giving evidence sometime in 2020. We just have to make sure she doesn't leave the country when Labour in government. She'll be giving evidence in that. You can see Module 6 care sector, which includes testing and tracing. Anyway, go through a few more comments before going to the other one. Let's have a look. Most public inquiries don't result in any criminal prosecutions. No, not at all. It's not the purpose of them. Remember the Iraq inquiry accused Blair of major wrongdoing. He hasn't been charged. No, indeed. No. Although, in that particular case, I don't know what you would have charged him for. Because it's not illegal. Like, effectively what he did is he lied to Parliament. It's not illegal to lie to Parliament. It's a matter for the Standards Committee, and you can be suspended from Parliament, but he's not an MP anymore, you know. In theory, they could take his parliamentary privileges away, but that would be about it. I don't know what crimes he would be accused of. Whereas in this case, you would think misconduct in public office. Because this isn't like a bit of deception. This was literally, right, they were getting advice. They were sort of going through decision-making process, and it was like, okay, if you do this, Prime Minister, lots of people will die. Okay, let's do that. That is, when you're talking about things like the VIP lane, when you're talking about like putting people into care homes without a negative COVID test, all of these things, I'm not a legal expert, but you just think about the sheer, like the Eat Out to Help Out, where we know from the evidence this week there were grave misgivings, and I don't mean from just the scientists. That's obvious. Someone with a GCSE in science know that wasn't a good idea, but just even from the political advisors, the evidence shows, and I don't just mean the evidence they gave, because although I will point this out, remember not every witness giving evidence will be doing it under oath or necessarily, but some of them will be. A public inquiry can require you to give evidence under oath. And I noticed Dominic Cummings gave his evidence under oath. So although we know that the people giving evidence may not be the most honest, if they're doing it under oath, they will be mindful not to say anything that is objectively untrue, because there's so much information. Like, they'll never get away with it. There's no way of being clever about it. If, let's say Dominic Cummings tried to claim something that was objectively untrue, he can't know that there isn't a WhatsApp message somewhere calling it out. So he won't have risked lying on oath, because then that's potentially prison, isn't it, right? That is where the public inquiry could result in directly result in criminal charges if anyone is found to have lied on oath. Unfortunately, see, the COVID inquiry, whoever wrote their website isn't as cynical as I am. I would have liked a nice, I'll just get rid of this thing because we've done the schedule now. I would have liked a nice thing on the website that tells you a nice easy chart to see which witnesses gave evidence under oath and which ones did not, right? But I assume they know which ones are reliable and which ones aren't. Dominic Cummings prioritising Brexit over pandemic preparation, nutters in charge. I mean, that was the ultimate problem, wasn't it? Well, ultimate problem. It was one of the problems. Another problem was the fact that no one involved in the senior decision-making knew anything about science. Dominic Cummings included. The fact that he can come across as less ridiculous than Boris Johnson is no great accolade. But, this prioritising Brexit over the pandemic was actual lunacy. But I don't know under what conditions you can charge people for misconduct in public office. All I would say is surely there's something in there. Surely something's going to come out. But there we go. Something I'm saying, hello from Plymouth. They've held it off. Oh, you've survived the storm, then well done. They've held it off long enough after the country, half the country won't riot against the findings. Well, when it comes to a riot, we don't want anyone to riot, but you don't need half the country to do it when you do. I thought the paradigm that occurs in the US is known as plea bargain. Yes, we don't. It's not. I don't think it will be. I don't think it'll be anything that'll help Matt Hancock. I don't know that it's a. You don't really read much about it in this country, do you? So I don't know that it'll be a particularly big thing. But as I say, so I think I went off on a tangent there. The thing with Matt Hancock is, although he's small fry politically, because he was never part of Boris Johnson's crowd, he was the health secretary. He ran the Department for Health and Social Care. So in terms of the organisational structure of the pandemic preparations and implementation, he was very senior. So I don't think it makes sense to allow Matt Hancock a plea bargain, because, okay, technically Boris Johnson's bigger, but Matt Hancock, let's say there were to be a major criminal investigation into this, Matt Hancock would be one of the main people who you would want to send down. I totally agree. I've been making that point for ages. No science in government circles or parliament or the main media. I mean, all of these groups do have access to top scientific advice. But the problem is when you don't take it, what happens when someone like Boris Johnson thinks he knows more. Like when he dismisses long COVID as, oh, it's just like Gulf War syndrome. It's like, no. What? Where do you get that from? Or when he goes to his scientists, I've watched this video on YouTube, they've got the cure for COVID. Isn't it brilliant? It's a hairdryer. You know, it's like, what? It says, now look what you've done. You've got yourself a YouTube COVID-19 tag for the live stream. I guess that's your monetization gone. No, why? Why would that be gone? It's absolutely fine. Tan was complaining about this recently, you know, with her YouTube stuff, getting demonetized when she mentions it. I don't. And I don't know whether it was because, so to go on a slight tangent, so in 2020, I'd just gone full-time YouTube, and then it was all bobbing along, Brexit, lovely, fine, reporting on that, all going well. And then COVID hit big time, and all of a sudden, no one was interested in anything else. It's like COVID. There were other political stories as well. The problem with on YouTube at the time is they were demonetizing an awful lot of COVID content in the guidelines because it was new, and they had to be really careful that they weren't monetizing disinformation. It was really hard to do videos, and I had to be, and the only way I got through it is I had to be really very, because I couldn't just not talk about it. It was the major political story. All of it. It was like from Brexit to COVID in like a matter of days, well, a couple of weeks anyway. And so, and it shouldn't have been. People initially, when I started doing the video, says, "Oh, but Phil, this isn't a political issue. Stop going on." It's like, it shouldn't have been a political issue. I agree. It should not have been. If the government were listening to the experts and going, okay, what's the best thing to do? Okay, that's the best thing to do. That's what we'll do. It wouldn't have been in a political issue. I agree. The only politics would have been the poor state of our preparations, the poor state of our NHS to cope. But as long as they'd have got the decisions right once it hit, then yes, it wouldn't have been. But that's not what they were doing. You know, the government, as we can see from this evidence, were applying politics to their decision making. So it was a political issue in this country. It was in some other countries as well. But yeah, I had to be really cunning. I had to. And the thing is, when I did the videos, I knew that like the algorithm would demonetize it, but it would get through on review because I knew I was complying with the guidelines. So I also had to, I couldn't do up-to-date videos. I had to do them a day in advance so I could have it manually reviewed. So I got through that. But then they changed things. They changed the guidelines and they also improved things. And I think because I've done a lot of COVID videos now on the channel, I've not had one monetized since like April 2020, I think. So I think I'm bulletproof on it. We'll find out later, but I think I'm bulletproof on it. I can actually just check and go into my thing, can't I? No, it's fine. It's cool. But it could be that some other people, if you're on a YouTube channel and you've not done COVID stuff and now you start doing it because of the inquiry, it could be some people are falling foul of that because the algorithm doesn't know whether you're reporting on it properly or are you one of the Russell Brand type misinformation channels. So that could be where the issue is. But anyway, slight tangent again. What level of science would I consider a minimum requirement for making decisions in government? Well, I ideally don't want any politicians making scientific decisions because let's say they're an Angela Merkel or Margaret Thatcher, like PhD in chemistry. I mean, you can't say fairer than that for a politician, can you? You know, like they still won't be experts in any particular field, whereas they can get the actual Professor Cleverclogs who knows more than anyone else in the world, or like many people in the world on this one thing. But if you're going to overrule a scientist, I would expect you to, at the very least, have a PhD in a related discipline. And even then, I would query it. So really, now, yes, politicians have to decide policy. And yes, there are sometimes other considerations. But if a scientist, in fact, not a scientist, if multiple scientists, like all of them that you talk to, say, this is a mad idea, don't do it, you don't do it. Like Dominic Cummings, I did the video, didn't I? he was saying, well, he claimed that his vote leave spads persuaded Boris Johnson not to have these chickenpox parties for COVID. That's what he claims. How true it is, I don't know. And it's like, yeah, but if we had a prime minister who took scientific advice, there would have never have been a danger. Because the Prime Minister would have said, oh, the Permanent Secretary for the Department for Health and Social Care says, maybe we should just have these COVID parties. To which the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer would go, are you insane? Don't you dare do that. To which a sensible Prime Minister would go, fair enough. That would be it. They listened to the behavioural scientists over the medical professionals. Do you know what? They didn't, though, did they? Like, they needed to listen to behavioural scientists, but they didn't. There was evidence from that as well. So you need behavioural scientists because you are asking a huge population of people to adopt a sudden change in lifestyle. I don't just mean with the lockdowns. We could have avoided most of the lockdowns, right? You are asking people to suddenly change a lot of the way they live their life. Now, you needed behavioural psychologists to explain the best way to do it. Some of the evidence that came out is the government were told we shouldn't be using fear tactics, we shouldn't use scare tactics, and yet that's what the government did. So they didn't listen to the behavioural scientists. We needed to, because the government needed to say, like we need to have these different behaviours in place for quite a long time. If the government had taken this seriously from the start, it would have been obvious that we needed people to adopt different behaviours, mitigations, things like wearing masks when indoors with people of different households, so shops or at work, in the office or whatever. We needed people to really avoid any situation where, like, so as long as you, as soon as you're saying something like have a mask on when you're indoor with people from different households, you're straight away saying it's probably not a good idea to be inside in a pub or a restaurant, and it's not a good idea to go round to your friends for dinner because you can't have a mask on if you're eating or drinking, right? So it's like, you know, you'd need to sort of be outside, put your mask on if you're having to walk through the house or use the toilet, and, you know, lots of sanitizer. And so, you know, these were behaviours we needed people to adopt, which the government didn't push anywhere near quickly enough. So, yeah, you needed, you know, you needed behavioural psychologists to explain to the government how best to achieve it. But there was no attempt to. Kissinger, never let a crisis go to waste. Oh, dear. I'm not sure I like Henry Kissinger, in all honesty. But why didn't any news outlets show New Zealand? Well, some did, to be fair. Not nearly enough. But even then, even New Zealand showed you, I mean, they got a lot of plaudits early on. But even then, the sort of COVID fatigue set in. So even there, like, I was thinking, back in 2020, my naivety, I thought to myself, because what happened during that brief period when we were wearing masks, or some of us were, we obviously had people like Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, Boris Johnson's dad even, actually, and Dominic Raab. Actually, I'm not sure. No, I'm going to withdraw Boris Johnson. I can't specifically remember if he was one of them. But Michael Gove, Boris Johnson's dad, Stanley Johnson, and Dominic Raab were all photographed in a shop without a mask on when they were supposed to be wearing a mask, right? So again, poor leadership. But I thought to myself in my naivety, weren't we showing that wearing a mask, because lots of other things went down as well, lots of other, you know, like airborne diseases was being reduced, the rate of it was being reduced. Of course it was, because everyone was wearing a mask. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be good if we sort of realised that if you're not like habitually wearing a mask all the time, although I still do, like when I go to shops and things like that. But shouldn't we at least, like, if we've got a cold, like I've now got a cold, my partner, right? So my partner developed a cough and a cold, a sore throat, that sort of thing this week. It's not COVID, thankfully. And apparently she was told at work last Monday, some silly cow was coughing and spluttering all over the kitchen. So obviously everyone who went in to make a cup of tea was getting that blasted in the face, even if she'd left 2 hours ago or something. So she was ill, and now she's passed it on to me. So now I've got a cough and a sore throat. Thank you very much. And you just thought, wouldn't it have been good if we could say, actually, not only can we mitigate against COVID, we can mitigate against flu and all sorts by whenever anyone is ill, just wear a mask when you go out. You know, when you go to the shops, if you're ill, don't just have a hanky clamped to your face. Just wear a mask. And then you won't spread your disease to others when you're out and about. But anyway, sorry. Are any recommendations going to arise from each module and then acted on before the end inquiry? No, that's what I mean about, you know, people needing to have a pretty good idea of what we want here. It's like, it's a really, the scope of this public inquiry is absolutely massive. And yeah, it's not like, I can't see it reporting back in less than 3 years, which again worries me, because it's like, you know, the more the world sort of peels back COVID, we don't really have restrictions anymore, but any sort of COVID mitigations even, the more likely we are to seed the next pandemic. Remember, although the government was expecting a pandemic, they were expecting a flu-based pandemic, not a SARS-based pandemic. So, you know, we've still got that one to come, presumably. I don't know. And some other countries, I suppose this might help us indirectly. You would think some other countries will have developed better systems. But my worry is we're less well prepared because we haven't developed any new systems at all. Every system we developed to help deal with COVID, the government then completely scrapped it as soon as it thought it didn't need it, because it doesn't want people thinking about COVID. Because from the Tories' point of view, if people are worried about COVID, they're not going to the restaurants and the pubs and all this, and it's going to hurt the economy. So instead, they've tried to make people not take it seriously at all. Which ironically means that now more of the workforce... Now what are they moaning about? They're moaning about the fact that that the workforce is much smaller, like 500,000 smaller or something in this country than it was before the pandemic. And they've particularly identified people in their 50s and 60s retiring early. It's like, do you think that might be because, well, maybe some of them have got long COVID and maybe the rest don't fancy getting it? Because I have to say, I'm, you know, in many ways have dodged a bullet, because I've had COVID once, which was September. So about 2 months ago now. And it was not very nice. But it obviously relatively mild in my case because vaccinated. But I think to myself, had I still been a teacher, how many times would I have had it? Especially when we talk about, you know, when they were wearing masks and stuff like that, they didn't do that in schools and colleges properly. They did in my class. But there would have come a point where even my managers would have said, you can't tell them to put masks on in your classroom anymore. But the thing is, like, and when they had it, I don't know how many people know this, like in schools and colleges, right? When the rules were in place for masks in schools, do you know what it was? You had to wear a mask in the corridor, but not the classroom. So you wear a mask when you're moving in corridors and you're spending a few minutes moving from one room to another. But once you're in that room and you're going to sit down with poor ventilation for like an hour with people from 20 different households or more in a school and closer together in a school, no masks. I think masks in classrooms is maybe a thing for like 2 weeks or something. And it came very late on. It came after the masks in shops, and it went away very quickly. It was utterly insane. They had this attitude that, young people don't get it. And it's like, yeah, they do. And then they pass it on to people at home. They weren't succumbing as much. Well, not for a few variations. I think round about Delta, all of a sudden it was starting to affect young people significantly, wasn't it? From memory. But they were still getting it and they were still passing it on. The government should have adopted the worst case scenario, not the reasonable one. Well, I mean, I don't know. What I do know is what they should have done is applied the maximum mitigations they would have been able to persuade the public to go along with. Now, I said myself, being perfectly honest, in 2020, I said, if you look at Asia, if you looked at the likes of South Korea and Japan, for example, and they didn't have lockdowns because they went full mitigate. They have masks everywhere. They have masks when they're outdoors, for goodness sake. You know, they took it very seriously, very early, and they avoided lockdowns, right? There may have been other things they got wrong. In fact, I seem to remember, was it the Japanese Prime Minister got into shit because the local population, like the Japanese population, didn't think he'd done well enough? And it was like, he did a damn sight better than us, mate. But you know you couldn't do that in a European country. We're way less deferential to authority in Europe in general, not just the UK. So I don't think the government would have gotten away with trying to get us to do everything Japan did or South Korea did. So what they needed to do is say, what can we do? And again, this is where your behavioural psychologists would have come in. What can we realistically do to get the right messages out there, to get people on board? And what can we do that people will comply with? Because there's no point in throwing out a load of rules that people will just not comply with. Because what you're going to do, create a load of new criminal offences, and then what you're going to do, go arresting people for what to members of the public will seem something silly. So you have to work with the public. That's what they should have done. You know, in terms of, you know, whether you take the worst case scenario or whatever, it's like, well, what's the maximum mitigations we can put in place here for the long term? And because that was the other problem with the government. Boris Johnson kept saying to the public, oh, we're going to do this thing. It's only going to be for a few weeks. And it's like, no, we needed to be, I get short-term goals. I get that. But we also needed to be persuading people, this is going to be here for a while. We need to mitigate against it. And if we do these smaller, less severe steps for longer, we won't need the more severe steps. John says, I sometimes wear a mask in a supermarket and I hope some half-wit asks, why are you wearing a mask? Well, I don't taunt people. But it has to be said, I do see the odd other person wearing them. I mean, I went to the supermarket like on Friday. I did see one other person wearing a mask. But that's it. I mean, that's been quite common for a long time now. In fact, it was quite bizarre because as soon as the government said you don't need to wear masks now, it was like it went away slowly. And what you noticed was like, so the next time I went in, it's like, I would say 3/4 were wearing masks, and it just slowly dwindled. And the last few tended to be elderly people. And now, if I go around, it's very rare I see anyone else wearing one. Listen, I didn't know this. In the USA, George Bush Jr. read a book. Never. Are you sure you've got the right president there? He read a book. Okay. So he read a book on the 1919 pandemic and set in place a response. Trump got rid of it. I was shocked. In fact, you just said it there. Shocked Bush actually read a book. So was I. Immediately. I didn't know that. But again, you know, because it's that sort of thinking, though, isn't it? I mean, I don't know why Trump got rid of it, because I didn't even know that there was anything in place and Trump just got rid of it. Or if I had, I've forgotten. But, you know, the way I will have seen it in terms of the Conservatives will be they hate public spending. They don't hate public money. They don't mind raising public money as long as it goes to their mates. They hate public spending. So something like readiness for an emergency that you don't know when it's going to hit, might not hit for another 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. You don't know. You know, even though the government was saying it's the most serious threat to the nation, they didn't know when it was going to hit. Might never have done. So it was, and you know, to some of these people, it's like, well, why are we spending money? Why don't we just wait for it to happen? It's always, because then we won't be ready, you idiot, and it'll cost you more. And the way they're thinking is, well, even if they think that, they'll just think, well, that's someone else's problem. Someone else will be in government then. Why should I? Why should I work out how to spend this public money on it and do without something else? That's their thinking. Oh, the £10,000 fine for sitting on a bench. Oh, yeah, some of it was utterly ridiculous. I mean, to be like, there was an awful lot of confusion. There were times where, to be fair, police were not given enough notice. I remember The problem was that the COVID like regulations kept changing so often, and there was one time where the new ones came out, and this was introducing new criminal offences, and it came out, I think it was 20 minutes before midnight of the day it was in force. So it was published literally 20 minutes before it came into force. And it's like, well, you're not giving... Because normally when a law comes into effect, you've got like a year or a year and a half or something for people to be trained, police officers to be trained, people to be notified and stuff like that. Now, obviously, you can't do that in this case. It was an emergency. But the public messaging was so poor that you had police. And a lot of these fines were, of course, quashed because, in actual fact, people hadn't broken the law. But it was particularly galling that you had people enforcing the law too stringently around the country, and then you had police officers outside Downing Street listening to the sounds of actual partying and doing nothing. I mean, they'll have radioed it in. Oh, there seems to be a party there. Is that illegal? So their commander on the other end, they're just going, yeah, just leave it alone, Sonny. Rarely see anyone wearing masks on buses anymore. Yeah, I can well imagine. I mean, I haven't been on a bus recently. I've been on a train a few times recently, and it's the same thing. It's like, there's me. I'm trying to think if I saw anyone else wearing a mask when I went to Liverpool and London. I can't remember seeing anyone else. Any law has to have the consent of the public. Well, certainly, yeah, the vast majority, because you can't lock up the whole country. Certainly. But that's, again, I mean, I was sort of touching on this sort of element with my video today on Rishi Sunak's AI summit. The fact that he held this summit, and it is important, you know, I don't know that the summit itself was successful, but, you know, the idea of trying to get international agreements on AI, that is actually important. I think that is a top issue. But the public don't see that. So why didn't Rishi Sunak, before he set this up, why didn't he get a government, like a public messaging going? Because that's what you do. You use nudge tactics, it's called, to change people's behaviour or to alert people to things. You know, governments used to be really good at that. Our governments used to be really, and they would be again if they would just let civil servants do it. You know, coming up with public messaging for information rather than disinformation. Whereas now it's like they don't want to use up any of the bandwidth on their culture wars. And, you know, it's a similar thing here. There was no public messaging, really. They had the daily conferences, but they kept changing everything. And it was like, and the problem is, you know, it didn't take long when they were talking about, oh, you must do this and you must do that, before one of them was undermining it. Boris Johnson, when he talked about, I shook everyone's hand in that ward. It's like, what? To... You know, and oh, just wash your hands, you'll be fine. No, you won't. I mean, it was important to wash your hands, but it's not like you can't think that's the way. You know, we don't pass it by hand; we passed it in the air. Fines were another money-making venture, nothing more. No, they weren't. They were never seen as a money-making venture. It wouldn't have helped the government from that point of view. They were just putting them in place because they were panicking. Instead of putting in place mitigations early enough, calmly, without them to go mad and communicating it to the public, it was knee-jerk reactions all the time. I mean, I remember it well in March. It was like, he was told there's going to be this major problem now. It's sweeping through. We had a test and trace system. You know, we had loads of warning. We'd seen it sweep through Asia, and we went, oh, that's interesting. Then we started to see it sweep through the continent of Europe, and we thought, hey, up, Italy's struggling. It hadn't hit us yet. We had no known cases at this point. We're a pissing island. You know, I'm not saying we shut up shop completely, but we could have, like, I remember during, like, SARS 1, people at the airports were having their, you know, forehead temperatures checked when they came into the country, particularly from China, but, you know, anywhere. That wasn't happening. I saw people photographing. Technically, there were tables there for people to... But there was no one manning them. It wasn't happening. It was not taking place. And then, you know... So then Boris Johnson one weekend said, everyone should not go out. Don't go out this weekend. And it wasn't an order. It wasn't the lockdown. He was just saying, don't go out this weekend. Well, of course they went out. And then, you know, what was it? Matt Hancock was at that horse race, wasn't he? Completely. Granted, that particular event, I think on reflection won't have done any harm because it was basically outdoors. But it's just, again, the show of it. It was the look, it wasn't giving the people, they weren't leading by example. And then, of course, they locked down the week after, but then that was something like 2 weeks late, considered 2 weeks late. British exceptionalism. Well, we had this sort of attitude in a few other countries as well, to be fair. But it was also beyond that, it was just Tory stupidity. Like, bear in mind, even David Cameron was taking this threat of a pandemic seriously. So actually, if we'd still had David Cameron in charge, the response would have been actually a lot better. It's not even like, I think conservative thinking doesn't help because although it would have, he still would have ransacked the NHS. He was still doing that. So we still would have had very poor preparations, but it would have been better because he was taking the pandemic seriously. He was bringing it up in international conferences and so on. He certainly would have taken it more seriously than Boris Johnson. And I'm not someone who regards David Cameron as a particularly serious person. Norway, they offered their test and trace for free. Tories, there's 37 billion. Well, they did. I will point out they didn't spend 37 billion. That was the budget, but they did spend an awful lot. It was certainly well over 20 billion that got spent in the end. And yeah, I mean, there were all sorts of things. It's like when we developed the app, we were going to do our own app, weren't we? Dominic Cummings wanted us to do this app, and it was like, so our trust with the government was already low, and his bright idea was to have a government-sponsored app, which of course didn't work. And it was like, was it Apple and Google said, well, we're developing one. Why don't you just use that? It's like, no, what are you on about? We're tech giants. We know what we're doing. No, we'll use our own. Bloody stupid. And then we ended up using that one anyway because ours didn't work. Surprise, surprise. And this is what, again, because that was a Dominic Cummings thing. Dominic Cummings got a mate to do it, didn't he? He's, I'll get this guy to do it. He's brilliant. And he's like Del Boy. He tries to come out like he's this brilliant genius. He's this absolute genius, and it's Boris Johnson that's the idiot. It's like, no, Dominic Cummings is actually, he's not an idiot. I don't actually think he's an idiot in the same way I think Boris Johnson is. But he's got far too much conceit. He's not capable. He's a political strategist. That's what he is. He's a political strategist. He's not a project manager. It's absolute madness for the world to be for the world to be facing a common threat. Obviously, what you do, you pool resources. What was the one thing we did anything like well? Developing a vaccine. We did that with international collaboration. Anything. When the world faces a common threat, the world pools its resources. That's how you'll get the best outcome. It should be obvious. But I mean, I think Germany's test and trace system cost like 50 million or something. It's like ours had a budget of 37 billion and it didn't do anything. Parliament actually said, they're not saying we shouldn't have had one, but what they said is, if we didn't have one at all, there would have been no difference. Parliament couldn't find any evidence that our £37 billion budget actually produced anything at all. So where'd the money go? We only spent so much on the workers, they were getting paid minimum wage. And their training consisted of reading a 2-page PDF. Adam, yes, this was a good one. We've left the EU now, we can control our borders. Pandemic emerges. Well, now we don't want to. Well, that was exactly it. It was quite bizarre from a Brexit point of view to observe that borders inside Schengen even were being restricted as the pandemic swept through because it was an emergency. And do you know what? The EU is flexible. It's an emergency. Of course, countries are going to shut off their... It doesn't matter that they're a part of a free movement area. They're going to close areas down. What? And we didn't. We didn't. And it's like, it gets me that you think back to like the 17th century and the Great Plague. And back then, we isolated places that had the plague. People wore masks. They weren't necessarily very good ones, but it's like we had a better attitude towards plague in the 17th century they do now. We'd regressed over the course of these centuries. We'd actually got worse. Well, Angry Pagan is saying, what can Starmer and Labour actually do with all this information? How do I think they'll move forwards on the many different facets presented? Well, that is the question, isn't it? I'm trying to think what I would do. I think at the very least, you would go to Operation Cygnus, wouldn't you? It'd be interesting. And I don't know why journalists haven't actually been asking Labour this, because you would think you would, wouldn't you? I would. I suppose it's because the media don't want to make a big thing about the fact that we face a future threat. Well, actually, we face a continued threat. Let's be honest. COVID's still here. I bloody had it 2 months ago. But it's... and I'm still feeling the effects. I'm not going to go as far as long COVID. I'm more tired than I was. It's not debilitating. But it's noticeable. And it's... but I would think, at the very least... if I were the Labour leadership coming in, I would think, right, well, we can't get caught out and then just claim, sorry, we're waiting for the COVID inquiry to tell us what to do. That's not going to look very good. So I would, obviously we know that building up the NHS is going to be part of it, but there's other things you need as well. I would go back to Operation Cygnus and say, let's start implementing this now. Because they could even use it to highlight how useless the Tories have been. Labour could come to power and actually say, look, we had the pandemic. They haven't actually built up any systems to help protect us. In fact, the ones they did build, they've trashed now. They're gone. We haven't got, Labour should say to the public, we don't currently have any at all pandemic response at all. We've got no systems in place for the next one or even the current one that's still around. So I think that's what I would do. You'd have to go to Operation Cygnus in the first case. At least get that pandemic response unit back, but start to work on the other recommendations as well. Build up your critical care units. I think the thing with that though is Labour. Obviously, the problem with that is we need to actually build up the capacity for the care we need right now. Hunt broke the NHS. Yeah, well, he had help, but yes, he was there. He was the health secretary round the Operation Cygnus time, certainly. He says, we haven't got worse, our policies have got worse, too much money and too much corruption. Well, they're quite cheaply corrupted. They don't cost much, I mean, Boris Johnson is like debasing himself on GB News for reportedly not even £1 million a year. I mean, he's getting $1 million just to write that crap in the Mail. So by his standards, he's going cheap. The £37 billion budget probably created a few new billionaires. I don't know, but it certainly would have made some people who did absolutely nothing much wealthier. In fact, apart from anything else, we know it did. Because remember, weren't we spending something stupid like £1 million a day on consultants for it? Like throughout. It's like, what was that about? Like throughout the whole thing. So there was certainly consultancy firms were making out of it. So almost everyone has long COVID. It'll be quite interesting to see what happens because this is like a ticking time bomb, isn't it? As if we didn't have enough health problems. What's Operation Cygnus? So in 2016, I think it was, David Cameron launched an exercise to test our readiness for a pandemic. If there was a deadly global pandemic, they sort of thought a flu-based one was most likely. How would our systems cope? So they ran it as a sort of like war game and then found where we had weaknesses, and then it produced various recommendations. And we then implemented hardly any of them. And then the ones we did implement, Boris Johnson got rid of, basically. The pandemic enabled socialism in the UK on a massive scale, but socialism for the rich. Well, in a way, for sort of everyone. There were various things that keep getting forgotten. I mean, today, and I'll be doing a video on this tomorrow, today's Tory outrage, there's actually a few to choose from, I suppose. But the main one would be Suella Braverman, for people who haven't seen. So her solution to homelessness is to take away their pop-up tents in winter, as we approach winter. But it has been pointed out that during the height of the pandemic, we had a scheme that involved getting homeless people off the streets into temporary accommodation, at least, but they were inside. And, people are pointing out, we could do it. We can do it if we need to. Because at the time, there was an absolute imperative to do it, and we did it. So we could do it again. And furlough, of course, was another one. But I think what was more important from a socialism point of view was to note that when the nation faced an emergency, capitalism was not the way it was solved. In fact, the capitalist aspects are the ones that screwed it up. So if you look at the socialist aspects of it, things like the furlough scheme, things like eventually extending free school meals across summer in 2020, things like the getting homeless people off the streets and actually into hotel rooms, temporary accommodation, things like that. Then you look at where capitalism sneaked into it. So then you had, I suppose the other thing also, you could say the free testing to begin with. You can go and get yourself tested, various testing centres around the place. So you actually built up the size of the state. They built up the size of the state to cope. Then capitalism was, shall we get the Department for Health and Social Care to order a load of PPE because they need it? Now, I'll tell you what, we'll give Dodgy Dave down the pub 2 million quid to go and buy some operation gowns. How about that? That was the VIP lane was the capitalism. The test and trace. We had a track and trace system. The NHS were running it, worked. Then Boris Johnson said, stop it, stop all track and trace. We're going to let the virus move through the population. We're going to take it on the chin, he said. We're going to be like Clark Kent turning into Superman. We're going to show you. Then it all went hideously wrong. So then, instead of giving 37 billion quid to the NHS and saying, sorry, we messed up, can you start your tracing system back up? It was like, no, what we're going to do, we're going to call it NHS Track and Trace, but in actual fact, it's going to have nothing to do with the NHS. We're going to give 37 billion quid to a former horse rider who famously failed in business. She was the head of Talk, wasn't it? When there was a huge scandal there. So a failed businesswoman and someone who, she might have been a really good jockey, I don't know. And we gave us 37 billion quid and then we got absolutely no benefit from it. So that was the difference between socialism and capitalism during the emergency. The socialism aspects worked and actually did some good. And the capitalist aspects just wasted a load of money. And I mean a load of money. And actually made things worse. Perfect time for when the NHS goes fully private. Yeah, not happening. Pushing people with dentistry already and people just pay rather than wait 12 months for appointment. Yes. I gather, I've not seen it myself, but I do gather from people that, you can even now in GP's practices get information on where you can get private treatment. Now, that's a real sea change because I have to say, a couple of years ago, someone I know needed some major mental health intervention. Couldn't get it on the NHS, wasn't happening. So I said, right, I'll pay for you to go private. Couldn't find anyone in the area to go private. So we actually tried to ask the local GP, can you recommend anyone? And they said, we're not allowed. So a couple of years ago, they weren't allowed to recommend private healthcare providers. And now they're actually pushing them. Rob said, I blame our education system, our opposition parties and ourselves, to be honest. The rich know their intrinsic interests, everyone else does not. Yes, that is a problem. I mean, ultimately, I keep going on, my main target for things like this is the media. Because if we had a free press that actually did its job, a lot of these things wouldn't be problems. Someone like Boris Johnson couldn't come to power. Someone like Liz Truss, someone like Rishi Sunak, it couldn't work. Someone like David Cameron, Theresa May could, I'd say, they still could. But they wouldn't be able to get away with half the crap they did. So I effectively blame the media here. And in terms of that, you can say education, the fact that we don't teach critical thinking is a big problem. But you could also argue, ultimately, what is critical thinking for? It's so that you can tell, or you've got a better chance. You can never, it's never perfect, but you've got a better chance of not falling for disinformation or misinformation. Whereas if we had a trusted media, then you'd be less likely anyway, because there's already people who will think they will trust the BBC over some Facebook group they're on. There are some people who do not. And yes, the critical thinking lessons may have been useful for them, although there will always be some people who are just lost to it. The pandemic also reminded us how important the arts are too. Where would we have been without music, books, shows, films and the like? Yeah, but the government don't see it that way either. They say the vaccine rollout was relatively successful as it's managed by the NHS in-house. Imagine if it was implemented by private companies owned by the Tories. Well, yeah, you say relatively successful. Let me find something here. Because it wasn't as successful as the government claimed, and part of the reason was not so much the way it was rolled out as the fact that we delayed rolling it out. Because that sounds weird. It's like, oh, weren't we the first to start rolling it out? Yeah, we were, but we kept delaying rolling it out to different people. Let me find it. What am I looking for? Here we go. I always keep this handy. Whenever any gobshites try to say, oh, you had this brilliant vaccine rollout, all thanks to Brexit, you know. And it's like, well, okay. And I had to do this recently. You know, let's forget for a moment that the head of our vaccine rollout program said that we would not have been able to start that rollout were it not for our membership of the European Medicines Agency. Because people forget that. We were still in the EMA at the time. And this is what it was like at the end of 2021. So after a year, and there we were, we're at the bottom of this one. Obviously, we weren't at the bottom. This is just a list of different countries. Portugal was the one ahead in terms of in Europe. This is obviously just Europe. I think Israel may have been the best in the world. So it's Portugal, Malta, Iceland, Spain, Denmark, Italy, Ireland, France, Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden. Even Sweden all did better proportionally than we did in terms of getting it out. So, you know, that success, it was relative. But again, a lot of the reason for that wasn't because we weren't rolling it out well. It's because the government kept delaying rolling it out to different groups. It took ages for us to roll it out to young people. And that's what caused us to get behind, more than anything. Hang on, that's the wrong one. What have I done with it? Oh, it's at the top. I had a doctor ask me if I had private medical insurance. This is on a visit to an NHS hospital on NHS time. Made the point to him and he suddenly looked worried. Okay. How do you teach critical thinking? Well, effectively, you have to be able to show case studies. I've done it. I've taught critical thinking in college. A bit late. You need to teach it earlier on. So you show various case studies and you show how, for example, you can present two things in two different ways and they'll get different impressions. So you're training people to ask questions. Like, I'll give you an example. One thing we used to do from a scientific point of view. So if you're reading about a science-based story in the media or usually it's a health-based story because those are the most interesting scientific stories to most people. You read a report, right? And you'll get people to look at. So in the report, it will quote various people. And ask yourself, who is it quoting? Whose views is it presenting? Is it Mrs. Miggins from down the street who doesn't know anything about anything? Or is it Professor Cleverclogs from the university who is a world expert on this thing? And, you know, just explaining to people that their views are not equivalent. So, you know, there's all sorts of things, aspects to critical thinking. It's realizing that, spotting false equivalence, realizing that correlation is not causation. I used to do a thing, for example, where there's a brilliant website where you can find like really weird correlations. Things like, the number of homicides with a fairly strong correlation to the amount of margarine bought in some state in America or something like that. The way I used to do it as an example that was really silly is to say that ice cream cures sunburn. And you go, no, it doesn't. It says, but if I was to plot the amount of ice cream bought compared, against the number of cases of sunburn, there'll be a fairly good correlation. It's like, and people know that because there are some correlations that people know are nonsense. So it's like getting them to say, the reason why you don't believe me on that is because you know that's nonsense, and that's because you know why it is that people buy more ice cream at the same time as people get more sunburn. So you know that, and you know therefore there is no correlation there, or no causation, sorry. But where you don't, because where you get found out is someone shows you a correlation, but you don't understand the link between them, or if there is a link between them, and you're more easily fooled. So it's just getting people to recognize if someone shows you a correlation, doesn't prove a link, can just be random. So you can absolutely teach critical thinking. It's a skill like any other. Something I was saying, we might have to do the last one, right? Tell me. So there was an exercise in school in the 90s. We matched cards of things in a job and had to work out what level of income we needed to have those things. We did that once. I asked to do it again, but no. Oh, tick box exercise, was it? That's unfortunate. But things like that. I know Labour are talking at the moment about having more like real world teaching as part of the education system. I have to say, I'm not totally convinced by Bridget Phillipson's ideas on it. I want to see more detail, because what she has said to me, it's a bit like, well, for a start, one of the things she suggested we do, we already do. So I thought, I'm but we certainly do need to teach more like real world skills, instead of just ramming people for, like, the other thing is you got kids who aren't that academic, and they get turned off by academia. What is the point of getting them to learn 10 GCSEs? There's some things you need. Everyone needs maths, everyone needs English. You want some science, you want some, humanities in there, but you don't need it all. Why aren't we teaching things that are more useful? And then, they learn the things that they want to specialise at for those who are academic. But there we go. Who decides what's real? Matt Hancock, apparently. Oh, yeah. So we'll leave it on this point. Yes, for those who don't know, according to the evidence, if the NHS were overwhelmed and certain groups of people had to be abandoned, in other words, can't provide care for you, sorry if you're going to die, Matt Hancock wanted to be the one who decide which groups lived and which died, or which groups would get treatment, should we say, and which groups were abandoned. And thing is, that's wrong from 2 points of view. First of all, if I were the Secretary of State, I wouldn't want that responsibility. Doctors make these, and these are terrible decisions. Doctors make these decisions, and they're trained to make these, and they're experienced at making these decisions. Because a junior doctor doesn't make these decisions, it's consultants who are very experienced. Health Secretary is not experienced in anything. Absolutely ridiculous thing to do. It reminds me of a few weeks ago, related to the doctors' strikes. I think this was a letter in the Times. It was a very short one. And it was referring to people going on about consultants saying, oh, they get loads of money and they get a pension that other people can only dream of. And then this person wrote in to say, yes, they may well get a pension that others can only dream of, but they make decisions that would give me nightmares. But there we go. So, we'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Thank you very much for coming on. Have a good evening, and until next time, I'll see you later.